I'll start right here in our Johannesburg studios with our two guests. Thank you so much for joining us, gentlemen. What I do want to start with is that mining tax that everybody had been talking about, that had been making headlines for such a long time. We heard absolutely nothing about it in this budget speech.
That's correct. Nothing was said about it, and perhaps to some commentators' surprise, but that said, I think that the ANC itself is just repositioning itself on mining tax. There's been a lot of talk about nationalisation. That seems to be on the back burner now, but I think within the party they need to align themselves. There's a discussion document going around within the party, and perhaps before it became government policy, they need to get their own philosophies worked out within the party.
Do you think that we're going to see it perhaps rear its head again probably later on in the year?
It's not something I don't think it's something they'll just jump into and actually increase the rate overnight without there being a lot of discussion. We saw it in Australia where they tried to bring in the super tax, which caused a huge uproar, and I don't think it still hasn't been brought into place. And it's also a question of which mines do you look at, because there's a lot of the mining companies that aren't doing that well. So do you then only target the gold mines, or what about the platinum mines that aren't doing that well at the moment?
I want to talk a little bit about that capital gains, Andrew. You were saying that's going to give us a lot to talk about, but then there'd also been before we were going into this budget speech, there had been some comment coming out about that tax for the super wealthy. Again, we didn't hear too much on that front, but talk to us about what did come out about the capital gains tax. We did see some increase there, and it was quite significant, even though the minister was saying compared to other countries, not as much as if you were to put it in comparison there.
Yeah, I think before the budget, there's obviously pressure on the fisc to increase collections. The message was that it was up from the midterm budget predictions, but down from the February budget predictions. So collections are tough, times are tough for the government, and people have been talking about an increase in tax rates, but we've got a small tax base. That's a difficult one. It's a political hot potato. And not many people raise the prospect of capital gains tax, but there it is. There's an increase across the board for natural persons, companies and trusts. And you're quite right, we are not on a level, a number of other countries have a higher capital gains tax rate than we do. So I think that was perhaps quite a clever little adjustment to the tax rates that hadn't been predicted by many, but it won't attract as much outcry as other tax rate increases.
I was speaking to a practitioner before the interview in preparation of this, and they were saying that if you look at our tax rates, yes, we can say that we're probably paying less than some other economies, but then if you were to compare it to, say, developed economies like Norway and Denmark right up there when it comes to tax. I think they're at 48% right now. And they were saying if you see what they get back, though, in their public services and what we get back for the tax that we pay, one could argue that we're probably paying more in tax. What would you say to that, Rob?
It becomes very difficult to measure just on a straight rate basis, because everyone's got to look at, what do you get back for it in terms of medical, what do you get back in terms of housing, infrastructure, that sort of thing. Whereas South Africa's moving from a relatively high tax rate, if you look at all the different taxes that are hidden in it, to a lot of user charges on infrastructure. So if you take all of that into account, the rates are getting fairly high. As far as the capital gains tax, one must remember it's all very well to say other countries have maybe 100% inclusion, but they do have indexation for inflation, which we don't have.
Well, we have Commissioner Magashule on the line, and you could probably join in there if you've got any pertinent questions that you would like to ask him there. Very warm welcome to you, Commissioner.
No, thanks very much, Hannah. I would just want to comment on two things. The first one is on the mining taxes. You correctly pointed out that that's an ANC discussion document, not a government discussion document. And from a government policy point of view, we have extremely elaborate processes that we follow in setting up tax policy. And we have a tax policy approach that we follow, which will touch on the second part, which is your CGT discussion, which, in essence, we're saying a properly constructed tax policy system should be equitable horizontally and should also be equitable at the vertical level. Let me just explain very quickly. At the horizontal level, we're saying everybody that earns approximately the same income, whether it's from interest, whether it's from dividends, whether it's from capital gains, they should pay the same amount of tax. And you would agree that it's an equitable way of constructing a tax system. At the vertical level, we're saying progressively as you earn more money, you should pay more tax because you can afford to pay more tax. And the increase in the inclusion rates of the capital gains tax is not necessarily to tax the rich. It's to make sure that, as the minister has pointed out quite clearly and succinctly, it's really to remove the arbitrage between income taxes and capital gains taxes and other incomes that are derived from other sorts of assets. You can imagine if you as a school teacher are earning 100,000 rand and you're paying, let's say, an effective tax rate of 18% or 20%, and then somebody earns income by selling some assets and realizes gains out of that thing, and he pays, as it is before this budget, an effective tax rate of 10%. You know, you will rather say to your employer, pay me through capital gains mechanisms or through dividends or through many other things. So we try and make sure that we have a fair tax system that makes sure that those horizontally who earn the same income pay at least an equivalent amount of tax on an equitable basis.
Rob, I'd like to throw this to you when it comes to what the Commissioner has said right now. Some of the argument that has come out is that if we do continue to see these increased taxing and he has said it has to be fair at the end of the day, what you are taxing people. And there has been that argument that you could find that in some countries, and it has happened, that in some countries where wealthy people are saying, well, you know what, we can go to another country then. Do you think that we are at threat of that happening, or is it in line right now, as the Commissioner is saying, that at the base that we are at now, it is actually fair?
It's hard to say whether it's fair or unfair, but I think what, just reading between the lines, what the Commissioner is saying is that we can expect that inclusion rate to increase going forward, which means then presumably there's going to be indexation to account for inflationary, which also then presumably means that to the extent that there are capital losses, you can offset those against your normal income tax. So it opens up a whole new broad spectrum to it. As opposed to when capital gains first came in, said we're going to bring it in at a relatively low rate because we don't want to complicate the system. It's going to be a 25% inclusion. There's going to be no adjustment for indexation. So I ask the Minister, does it now mean that we can look forward to further inclusions at a higher rate and more complications in the legislation to bring into account those other items I mentioned?
Commissioner, would you like to respond to that?
Yes, I would like. Thanks very much, Hannah, for giving me the opportunity. The Minister made it very clear that, earlier in the closed press conference that we had, that the debate around indexation when it comes to capital gains tax will continue. And correctly, as the previous speaker has said, the capital gains inclusion rates have been at their levels for 10 years. And that means we have lived up to our commitment to say, look, we are not going to fast track the increase in terms of the inclusion rates and the effective tax rate when it comes to capital gains. So that we have lived up to. And today in Parliament, the Minister also repeated the same thing to say, look, this does not mean there's going to be a rapid increase in the inclusion rates of capital gains tax going forward. We have to conclude the debate around indexation. We've got to make sure that, all the considerations in terms of, eroding people's gains by inflation, are taken care of. And the debate around, whether you can write off your losses against these things. You will remember the Minister also introduced the gambling tax, which is a tax on winnings and so on. One of the arguments when this tax was being debated, or the proposals were being debated, was what about the losses? And it's on the same basis that before we can increase any tax rate, we would debate, we will consult quite widely with the stakeholders and interested parties until we reach a balanced view of these things. But for us to increase it after 10 years, yes, sorry, Hannah, for us to increase it after 10 years, I'll conclude now, was based on the fact that it's one of the lowest around the world. I mean, on average, and I've got the figures to back this up, on average, I mean, the inclusion rates are sitting at around 100%, as the Minister mentioned. So, we still are very responsible and progressive in terms of, making sure that there's equity.
Commissioner, one of the alternatives that has been given in terms of taxing the wealthy or the rich in the country has been more stringent auditing of people that are in the rich bracket here in South Africa. And again, the minister did allude to that. Going forward, what is your office wanting to do about that, particularly with referral to what the minister said about that new ombud that's going to come into play this year?
Well, I missed the last bit, but I suppose what the question is, what are we going to do in terms of auditing high net worth individuals and so on? Is that the question?
Yes,
Sorry,
that
Hannah.
is, Commissioner. Yes, that is, Commissioner.
Okay. Yes, the minister did mention that one of our focus areas this year is to make sure that we get behind the structures that most high net worth individuals use. In essence, the many think that one of the structures that they use are trusts, you know, and it's not just one trust. It's a trust that has a beneficiary whose beneficiary is another trust which is offshore, and it's a really, really contorted and connived, you know, structuring of trust and a series of trusts. So we hope now, with the use and accumulation of third-party information that we have now, we can be able to construct the balance sheets and income statements of these high-net individuals and be able to tax the beneficiary of all these other structures, you know. And we're also trying to make sure that we introduce other legislative changes that remove this tax arbitrage that are there. So you will see a real focus on high-net individuals. We announced, I think, 2 or 3 months ago that we have identified, you know, exactly 9,300 and something individuals who we want to take through some process of auditing and lifestyle checks and so on to make sure that, you know, everybody pays their fair share when it comes to their contribution to the fiscus.
Andrew, I'm going to come to you if you would like to pose a question or to you, Rob, if you'd like to pose a question to the Commissioner there. One of the things I would like to just point out here is tax practitioners owing over 260 million rand in outstanding taxes, Andrew. And one of the things the Minister was saying was that if tax practitioners are in this space right now, what kind of advice, and not all of them, but what kind of advice would they be giving to their clients? What would you respond to that?
Well, as a tax practitioner myself, I think there's an increasing tendency, and it's an international tendency, to blur the line between the old recognized practice of tax avoidance and tax evasion. Tax planning within the constructs of the Act is perfectly acceptable, and you know that's working within the realms of the law. Tax evasion, fraud, those sorts of things are not. Now, the proliferation, and I mean, we probably won't get into the technical amendments that have been suggested or hinted at in this particular budget speech, but there's a continuing proliferation of anti-avoidance provisions that apply to both companies and individuals. And the Commissioner was talking about complex structures that families use. It's quite true. A lot of high net worth individuals do undertake very complex tax planning structures. But one needs to be very careful to try and distinguish between what is the right amount of tax, as the Commissioner said. The right amount of tax is what the Act says you must pay. And when you structure within the realms of the Act, then you are paying the right amount of tax. And I think the continuing making the Act more and more complex to try and close down specific loopholes is becoming a problem for tax practitioners and even more so for the tax-paying public. And
you're not the only one who said that. I want us to come, we're going to go to break, we're going to come back to that issue of complexity, and we do have to talk about that because you're not the first person to say that, Andrew.